Today's video is about a cocaine supply network uncovered through encrypted communications, a serving prison officer who formed an inappropriate relationship with a convicted drug dealer, and a gang who lured a man to a Nottingham street and carried out a violent robbery. These cases didn't surface overnight. They unfolded across years in different parts of the country, different offences, different circumstances. But all were uncovered in the same way, through evidence built gradually, often long before those involved realized they were being investigated. What none of them understood was how early that scrutiny had begun, or how much information investigators already had before arrests were made. This is the story of organized crime, misconduct, and serious violence, and the investigations that exposed them, piece by piece, until each case reached its final conclusion. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. Our first story revolves around the gang who built an operation to look ordinary. On paper, the businesses involved appeared to be legitimate commercial outfits operating within the logistics and transport sector. They dealt with storage, movement of goods, and routine distribution, the kind of work that attracts little attention when done correctly. Vehicles moved regularly, premises were leased openly, and nothing about the outward-facing operation suggested criminal activity. To outsiders, the companies functioned like any other in the industry. Deliveries were scheduled, invoices were generated, drivers followed set routes, and vehicles traveled across regions without drawing scrutiny. The network was not informal. It was structured around defined roles, with each man operating within a clear position in the hierarchy. At the center of the operation were Christopher Dean and Paul Connolly. Together, they directed the commercial-scale buying and selling of cocaine. Dean acted as a senior organizer. He controlled decisions around supply and distribution, but deliberately kept distance from the physical drugs and communication. We will discuss this in a few minutes. Paul Connolly handled the day-to-day running of the operation. He functioned as the main point of contact between the organizers and the wider network. While Dean set direction, Connolly executed it. The network's activity was not confined to a single location. Operations stretched across multiple areas, with vehicles traveling between regions as part of what appeared to be standard commercial work. Alongside the top-level members was Christopher Boylan, who played a dual and very important role. We will talk about him in detail in a later part of this video. At a lower level was Cameron Ruddy. Ruddy acted as an assistant. He processed orders, handled cash and drugs on behalf of others, and stored commodities ready for onward supply. He also arranged testers for potential buyers and assisted with large consignments when required. His involvement was operational, not strategic. At the time, there was nothing obvious to trigger intervention. There were no immediate complaints, no visible disputes, and no clear breaches that would prompt attention. But while the operation appeared stable on the surface, its success depended on one critical assumption: that their communications were secure. Communication across the network was built around encrypted devices, primarily EncroChat handsets. Paul Connolly operated under the EncroChat handle WordEJ, which became a central node within the network. Through this account, Connolly communicated with suppliers, customers, and lower-level operatives, relaying decisions that originated from Christopher Dean while insulating him from direct contact. Dean's deliberate avoidance of encrypted devices was a calculated move, designed to keep his name detached from operational traffic. Messages exchanged on EncroChat were functional rather than conversational. They were short, direct, and transactional in tone. Quantities, prices, locations, and timings were discussed using coded language that avoided explicit references to drugs, money, or individuals. As trust in the encrypted platform grew, so did the scale and frequency of the activity. The commodity at the center of the operation was Class A cocaine. Cocaine was sourced and moved through the network in wholesale quantities, not street-level deals. The court heard that orders were placed in kilogram blocks, with supply structured to feed onward distribution rather than immediate sale. This was not opportunistic dealing. It was planned, repeat, and scaled. Christopher Boylan sat at the center of this phase of the operation. He was responsible for arranging the purchase of cocaine in bulk and coordinating its movement onward through trusted contacts. Messages recovered from encrypted devices showed Boylan placing orders for multiple kilograms at a time, then overseeing how those consignments were split, stored, and redistributed. Drugs were deliberately not kept in one fixed location. Instead, cocaine and cash were moved between short-term storage sites to reduce the risk of seizure and to avoid patterns that could be identified through surveillance. These locations were chosen for convenience and plausibility rather than isolation. Premises linked to Boylan's legitimate skip hire business played a critical role. Yards, commercial units, and vehicles already associated with waste and logistics activity were used to temporarily store drugs and cash. These environments allowed frequent movement without attracting attention, as staff, vans, and deliveries were already part of the normal rhythm of the business. Transportation followed the same logic. Cocaine was moved using vehicles that appeared to be engaged in routine commercial work. Vans and cars traveled along routes consistent with legitimate logistics movements, often between regions, without behavior that would distinguish them from ordinary traffic. This approach reduced exposure at every stage. But it also created a vulnerability, and by that point, the network was no longer operating unnoticed. The methods that had protected it were already being used to map it. The turning point in the investigation came with the national infiltration of the EncroChat network by law enforcement. From that point onward, encrypted messages were no longer private. They were being collected in real time and stored for analysis. Investigators were able to recover large volumes of historical messages, allowing them to reconstruct conversations that spanned months. These were not isolated fragments, but complete threads showing how deals were arranged, quantities were discussed, and most importantly, how responsibilities were divided across the network. Patterns began to emerge quickly once the data was examined in full. Surveillance teams were deployed to confirm what the digital intelligence suggested. Physical movements matched what was being discussed in messages. Whereas vehicles linked to the network traveled routes consistent with the logistics activity described on EncroChat. Individuals were observed meeting at locations referenced indirectly in the communications. By combining encrypted data with surveillance, investigators were able to move from suspicion to certainty. The network's structure, roles, and methods were no longer theoretical. They were documented, verified, and supported by multiple sources of evidence. With the communications exposed and movements mapped, police were now in a position to act, shifting the investigation from monitoring to enforcement. Coordinated warrants were executed across multiple locations linked to the network, targeting both residential addresses and premises connected to legitimate business operations. Police carried out arrests of the key figures, including Christopher Dean, Paul Connolly, Christopher Boylan, and Cameron Ruddy. Searches of properties and business premises uncovered significant evidence too. Officers seized large quantities of Class A cocaine, packaged in a manner consistent with wholesale supply. Cash was also recovered, reflecting proceeds from drug transactions. Vehicles linked to the operation were searched and seized, including those used as part of routine commercial activity. Mobile devices, storage media, and documentation were also recovered, further reinforcing the structure of the network. By the time arrests were made, investigators already possessed a detailed picture of the conspiracy. With the network dismantled and its key members in custody, the focus shifted from investigation to prosecution, where the EncroChat evidence would be placed at the center of the case. The case concluded at Bolton Crown Court, where prosecutors set out the scale of the conspiracy and the roles played by each defendant. What we have already discussed. The court was told that the investigation had been led by specialist detectives from Greater Manchester Police's Challenger team in Wigan. All 4 defendants pleaded guilty to their respective roles in the conspiracy. In passing the sentence, the court highlighted the sophistication of the network. The judge made clear that the use of legitimate businesses as cover and the appearance of professionalism were aggravating factors, not mitigation. Christopher Dean pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply cocaine. He was sentenced to 12 years and 9 months imprisonment. Paul Connolly pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply cocaine, possession of cocaine with intent to supply, and possession of criminal property. He was also sentenced to 12 years and 9 months imprisonment. Christopher Boylan pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply cocaine and possession of criminal property. He was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months imprisonment. Cameron Ruddy pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply cocaine with major consignments, including one involving 15 kilograms of cocaine destined for Lancashire. He was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment. Collectively, the 4 men were sentenced to more than 40 years in prison, bringing the conspiracy to an end. With the first case concluded, the focus now shifts to the next, where the abuse of trust did not take place within organised crime, but inside the prison system itself. Megan Breen entered the prison service at a young age, beginning her employment in June 2021. At the time, she was 21 years old, stepping into a role that placed her inside secure environments and required strict adherence to professional boundaries. She was employed as an operational support grade, a position that, while not uniformed as a prison officer, still involved daily contact with prisoners and access to controlled areas. Her duties were split across 2 linked establishments in Gwent. One was HMP Prescode, a Category D open prison that houses men nearing the end of their sentences and preparing for release. The other was HMP Usk, a Category C closed prison holding adult male prisoners, including vulnerable inmates and those convicted of serious offences. Although different in security level, both prisons operated under the same management structure and shared staff. During her induction training, Breen was formally warned about the risks of inappropriate relationships with prisoners. The court later heard that this training explicitly covered the dangers of manipulation, the imbalance of power, and the serious criminal consequences that could follow any breach of conduct. By the time the events at the centre of the case began to unfold, Breen was 22 years old, working regularly across both establishments and fully aware of the rules governing contact with inmates. And it was during these routine shifts, in an environment built on control and trust, that the first inappropriate contact quietly began. The prisoner at the centre of the case was never named in court reporting, but his criminal background was clearly set out. He had been convicted in October 2020 of conspiracy to supply Class A drugs and sentenced to 4 years and 4 months imprisonment. The offence placed him firmly within the category of serious organised drug offending rather than low-level supply. In May 2021, while still serving that sentence, he was transferred into the open prison estate as part of the progression toward release. It was during this period that he came into contact with Megan Breen through her work. By the time the relationship began, he was already benefiting from relaxed conditions, including home leave and day release, privileges granted only to prisoners assessed as lower risk. The court heard that the relationship developed over a defined and limited period, between February and May 2022. This was not a long-standing connection that predated Breen's employment. Communication between them quickly moved beyond incidental contact. Breen used a prison-issued Nokia mobile phone that the prisoner had been authorized to use while on release, and the two also communicated via Snapchat, a platform well known for its disappearing messages. Investigators later recovered evidence of sustained contact across both channels. The nature of those communications was described in court as openly emotional. Messages recovered showed expressions of affection, references to love, and the use of heart emojis. The exchanges reflected a personal relationship rather than accidental boundary slippage. The relationship extended beyond messaging. Breen arranged to meet the prisoner while he was on home leave, travelled to Merseyside, and spent time with him socially. The court heard that the visit coincided with her 20th birthday and that the two stayed together overnight in a hotel. While in Merseyside, Breen also socialised with the prisoner's family. She spent time with them openly and later acknowledged that she had met them on more than one occasion. And it was this crossing from private messaging into real-world meetings that transformed a breach of conduct into a criminal offence and set the case on a path toward exposure. The escalation did not stop there. On one occasion, the prisoner met Breen socially alongside two of her colleagues from the prison service. The colleagues were unaware of his identity and did not know that the man they were drinking with was a serving prisoner. The court later heard that this placed them in an extremely difficult position, unknowingly socializing with someone who should never have been present in that setting. By introducing a prisoner into a social environment with prison staff, without disclosure, Breen crossed another clear boundary. What had begun as private contact had now exposed others to risk, compromised professional integrity, and blurred the lines between custody and freedom. And it was only after these boundaries had been crossed repeatedly that the relationship finally came to light inside the prison walls. The relationship came to light through disclosure from Breen herself. In March 2022, she confided in a colleague, William Morgan, about a recent trip she had taken to Liverpool. During that conversation, she revealed that she had met a man socially, stayed with him overnight, and that he was a prisoner from Prescode. When questioned further, Morgan expressed disbelief. In response, Breen identified the man directly by pointing to his image on a computer screen inside the prison, confirming that the individual she had been seeing was a serving inmate. Morgan reported the matter to senior staff without delay. From that point onward, the issue moved rapidly out of Breen's control. Prison authorities escalated the disclosure, and Breen was suspended from duty in March 2022 while a formal investigation was launched. As part of that investigation, officers searched the prisoner's cell. Inside, they recovered a piece of paper containing Breen's mobile phone number and her Snapchat handle. This discovery provided physical corroboration of the relationship and directly linked the prisoner to a member of staff. Investigators then examined Breen's mobile phone, which confirmed sustained contact over a period of time. Alongside the misconduct investigation, Breen was also charged with unauthorized access to a computer, relating to her use of prison systems during the course of the relationship. Although this charge was later ordered to lie on file, it formed part of the wider picture of boundary violations examined by the court. And with the investigation complete and the evidence secured, the focus shifted from discovery to prosecution, and the consequences that would follow in court. The case was brought before Cardiff Crown Court, where Megan Breen entered a guilty plea to misconduct in public office. The court heard mitigation on Breen's behalf. She was described as a single mother, with primary responsibility for a young son. It was also confirmed that she was pregnant at the time of sentencing and acted as a carer for another child. Defense submissions emphasized the impact that immediate imprisonment would have on those dependent on her rather than on Breen alone. Sentencing was delivered by Tracy Lloyd Clark, who made clear that the offence was serious and that Breen had known her conduct was wrong. Breen was sentenced to 10 months imprisonment, suspended for 18 months. She was ordered to pay £500 in prosecution costs and to complete 15 days of rehabilitation activity. And with the court's decision delivered, attention turns to the final case, one defined not by misconduct or conspiracy, but by sudden, organised violence on a Nottingham street. The final case begins with a transaction that appeared legitimate on the surface, but was carefully engineered from the start. The advert offered high-value goods, described later in court as laptops and other electronic items. It was posted under the control of Ionel Radu, who would later be identified as the organizer behind the plan. He did not take part in the physical attack, which we will discuss in a later part of this video, but was responsible for orchestrating how and where it would take place. The pricing suggested a private sale rather than a retail deal, attractive, but not so cheap as to raise immediate suspicion. There was nothing immediately unusual about the exchange. Contact was made, details were agreed, and a meeting was finally arranged. What the victim did not know was that the advert was false. There were no laptops, no goods at all. The purpose of the listing was not to sell anything, but to draw a target into a controlled environment where others were already in position. Under Radu's direction, the meeting was arranged in the Meadows, a residential area south of Nottingham city centre. The specific location was Hope Close, chosen for its limited visibility and easy access routes. The time was set for 27th February 2025 at around 4:45 p.m, when normal foot traffic would help the meeting blend in. Radu was not acting alone. He recruited a group of men from London to carry out the robbery. He had travelled to Nottingham with George Chirita, Kostel Ili, Ionut Stoica and Mihai Melu. Each had a role to play once the victim arrived. We will talk about them in a few minutes. The group travelled using a vehicle fitted with false number plates, a deliberate step to hinder identification and avoid detection. CCTV and ANPR evidence later showed that they had scouted Nottingham the day before the attack, driving around the meadows to assess access routes, escape options, and the suitability of the meeting location. The victim was instructed to attend alone. He brought with him £6,000 to £7,000 in cash and was wearing a Rolex watch valued at £11,000. Details the group already knew. The court later heard that isolating the victim was deliberate, designed to remove any resistance or witnesses at the point of contact. The advert had done its job, and what followed was not a deal, but an ambush. On the day of the robbery, deception was central to the setup. Radu told the victim that his 16-year-old son would be responsible for completing the exchange. That role was played by George Chirita. When the victim arrived on Hope Close, he was the first person encountered. Chirita had been positioned deliberately as the point of contact. Acting on instructions given in advance, he appeared calm and approachable, guiding the victim where to park and reassuring him that the exchange would be quick. Chirita then led the victim away from the street and towards an alleyway behind nearby houses, close to a disused shop. The route removed the victim from open view and placed him exactly where the rest of the group was waiting. As soon as the victim entered the alley, the situation shifted. Ionut Stoica and Kostel Ili moved in from behind. These two were identified in court as the primary physical attackers, the muscle of the group. One of them produced a knife, immediately escalating the encounter and removing any illusion that this was a legitimate sale. The attack began without warning. The victim was punched and kicked, forced to the ground and restrained. During the assault, he was stabbed in the arm, suffering a serious injury while the attackers continued to threaten him. The court later accepted that the violence was sustained and intentional, not incidental. While Stoica and Ili carried out the assault, Mihai Melu assisted, remaining close and supporting the attack. His role was not passive. He was part of the group controlling the situation while the theft took place. As the victim lay on the ground, the offenders searched him. They took between £6,000 and £7,000 in cash and removed his Rolex watch, valued at £11,000. The theft was precise. Only items the group already knew about were taken. The attack ended abruptly due to intervention from a passerby. A shout from nearby drew attention to the alleyway. That interruption caused the group to break off the assault and flee before further injuries could be inflicted. The victim was left alone, injured and bleeding in the alleyway. And while the attack itself lasted only minutes, leaving a trail of movements and evidence that police would soon begin to unravel. The investigation moved quickly once police were alerted to the attack. Detectives began by gathering dashcam footage from vehicles in and around Hope Close, capturing the movements of cars entering and leaving the area around the time of the robbery. This was combined with extensive CCTV trawls across the meadows and surrounding roads. From that footage, officers identified a grey Skoda Octavia used by the offenders. The vehicle's movements became a central thread in the investigation. Using ANPR tracking, police were able to trace the Skoda's journey into Nottingham, its movements within the city, and its immediate departure after the robbery. The data showed the group had travelled directly back toward London, consistent with a pre-planned operation rather than a local crime. CCTV analysis also revealed activity in the hours leading up to the attack. Footage showed members of the group visiting a KFC restaurant in Nottingham shortly before the robbery. This seemingly minor detail helped detectives confirm the identities of those present in the vehicle and place them together shortly before the offence took place. With the suspects identified, police carried out raids on multiple addresses in London linked to the group. These searches resulted in arrests and the recovery of further evidence connecting the men to the robbery. One suspect, Mihai Melu, was not initially found during the raids. However, officers recognized a distinctive item of clothing seen in CCTV footage at his home address. When this was shown to him, Melu later handed himself in, accepting that he had been identified. As the evidence was assembled, CCTV, ANPR data, dashcam footage, and physical links between the suspects, the case against the group solidified. Each man was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit robbery, with additional robbery charges brought against several of them in connection with the same incident. By this stage, the investigation had moved beyond identification. The sequence of events, the planning, and the roles of each individual were now backed by multiple, independent sources of evidence. And with the case built, the focus shifted from investigation to the courtroom, where the full scale of the violence and planning would be laid bare. The case was heard at Nottingham Crown Court, where prosecutors laid out a detailed picture of a robbery that had been planned in advance and executed with deliberate violence. During the proceedings, victim impact statements were read to the court. The victim described believing he was going to die during the attack. He spoke about the lasting effects of the stabbing, the psychological trauma, and the loss of confidence that followed. The court accepted that the consequences of the robbery extended far beyond the physical injuries sustained on the day. All 5 defendants were convicted of conspiracy to rob. The jury rejected any suggestion that individual roles were minor or incidental, finding that each man had knowingly taken part in a plan that relied on deception, isolation, and the threat of extreme violence. Ionel Radu received the longest sentence, 10 years imprisonment. The judge also noted that Radu would be deported at the end of his sentence. George Chirita was sentenced in his absence to 7 years imprisonment, having fled the country before the conclusion of the case. The judge stated that his absence did nothing to reduce his responsibility for luring the victim into the ambush. Ionut Stoica was sentenced to 8 years imprisonment for his role in the attack and his involvement in the conspiracy. Kostel Ili also received 8 years imprisonment, while Mihai Melu was sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK Crime Documentaries.